I've been coming to Mel's Corner Diner every Thursday morning for the past 8 years, ever since I moved back to Millfield after my retirement from the Army. Same booth, same black coffee, same blueberry muffin if they have them fresh. The waitresses know my order by heart, and I tip well because I remember what it was like working for minimum wage when I was 18. My name's Frank Garrison, and I'm 72 years old. Most folks in town just see me as the quiet old guy who reads his paper in the corner, minding his own business. They don't know that I spent 34 years in the United States Army, retiring as a command sergeant major. They don't know about the bronze star with V device sitting in a shoebox in my bedroom closet, or the Purple Heart I earned when an IED took out half my convoy outside Fallujah in 2005. Hell, most of them probably don't even know my last name. That's fine by me. I never was one for drawing attention to myself, and after 3 decades of telling young soldiers what to do, I was looking forward to a quiet retirement. My wife Sarah had passed 4 years earlier from cancer, and our only son Danny lived out in California with his family. I kept myself busy with small projects around the house, volunteer work at the VA hospital 2 towns over, and my Thursday morning ritual at Mel's. The diner sits on the corner of Main and Elm, housed in what used to be a Texaco station back in the 50s. Mel's grandfather had converted it in 1963, and 3 generations of the Kowalski family had been serving up comfort food to the people of Millfield ever since. The walls were covered with local high school sports photos, pictures of town festivals, and a small section near the register dedicated to local boys who'd served in various wars. My own photo hung there somewhere, a young staff sergeant's portrait from my first tour in Desert Storm. But it was tucked behind newer pictures, and nobody really looked at it anymore. I preferred it that way. The last thing I wanted was some well-meaning civilian thanking me for my service while I was trying to enjoy my coffee and read about the local high school football team's chances this season. I'd done my job, served my country, and now I just wanted to be left alone to enjoy what years I had left. Everything changed on a Thursday morning in late September. I'd just settled into my usual booth when I heard the rumble of motorcycles outside. 3 Harley-Davidsons pulled into the parking lot, their engines unnecessarily loud in the quiet morning air. I glanced up from my paper as 3 men in leather jackets strutted through the front door like they owned the place. The leader was a mountain of a man, probably 6'5" and pushing 300 pounds. His arms were covered in tattoos, and his leather vest bore the patches of the Satan's Sons Motorcycle Club. I'd heard about them from Sheriff Patterson when I'd helped him with some security advice for the county fair. They'd been moving through small towns across the state, dealing drugs and intimidating local businesses into paying protection money. The big guy's name patch read Crusher, and he lived up to the name. His 2 companions looked like standard-issue muscle, all leather and attitude, but lacking their leader's obvious intelligence. I could tell from the way Crusher moved that he'd probably done time, and from the way he scanned the room that he was looking for the easiest targets. They took a table near the center of the diner, speaking loud enough for everyone to hear them complain about the dump they'd found themselves in. Crusher made crude comments about Jenny, the 20-something waitress who'd been working at Mel's since graduating high school. The other customers started finishing their meals quickly and leaving, including old Mrs. Henderson, who'd been coming here longer than I had. I kept reading my paper and drinking my coffee, but I was watching them in my peripheral vision. 34 years in the Army teaches you to assess threats without looking like you're paying attention. These weren't weekend warriors playing dress-up. These were predators, and they were testing the waters to see how much resistance they'd face. After about 20 minutes, Crusher stood up and walked over to my booth. He loomed over me, his massive frame blocking out the overhead light. "Hey, old man," he said, his voice carrying that particular tone of manufactured menace that small-time criminals think makes them sound dangerous. "Me and my boys like this booth better. Why don't you move your wrinkled ass somewhere else?" I looked up from my paper, meeting his eyes calmly. "I'm sorry, but I've been sitting here for 8 years. There are plenty of other tables available." His face darkened. "I don't think you heard me, Grandpa. I said move." The diner had gone completely quiet. Jenny had stopped refilling coffee cups and was standing frozen by the counter. Mel himself had emerged from the kitchen, a short, stocky man in his 50s who looked terrified but was trying not to show it. The few remaining customers were staring at their plates, clearly hoping to avoid becoming part of whatever was about to happen. "I heard you just fine," I said, folding my newspaper carefully. "But I'm not moving. You're welcome to sit anywhere else you'd like." That's when Crusher's hand shot out and slapped me across the face, hard enough to knock my reading glasses onto the table. The sound echoed through the diner like a gunshot, followed by absolute silence. "Maybe now you'll listen better," he said, grinning at his companions who were chuckling and nodding their approval. The slap stung, but it was nothing compared to what I'd endured during SEER training or the beating I'd taken from insurgents before my squad found me outside Baghdad in 2004. What bothered me wasn't the physical pain, it was the humiliation of being treated like a helpless old man in front of people I'd known for 8 years. I could feel every eye in the diner on me, waiting to see how I'd respond. Part of me wanted to show this punk what a career soldier could do, even at 72. I'd stayed in shape, and I'd learned hand-to-hand combat from some of the best instructors the Army had to offer. But I also knew that assaulting someone, even in self-defense, could land me in jail. At my age, that was a risk I couldn't afford to take. So I did something that probably surprised everyone, including myself. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my cell phone, and made a call. "Danny?" I said when my son answered. "It's Dad. I'm at Mel's diner, and I could use some help." Crusher laughed, a harsh sound that filled the quiet restaurant. "What's the matter, old man? Calling the cops? They can't help you learn manners." But I wasn't calling the cops. Danny was a tech executive in Silicon Valley, but before that, he'd been a captain in the 75th Ranger Regiment. More importantly, he'd kept in touch with his old unit, and several of his former teammates had retired to the area after their service ended. The conversation was brief. I simply told Danny where I was and that I'd been assaulted by some bikers who were causing trouble. I didn't embellish or exaggerate. I just stated the facts and hung up. "Daddy's coming to save you?" Crusher taunted, settling into my booth like he owned it. "This should be fun." What he didn't know was that Danny lived 3 hours away in California, but his old Ranger buddy Mike Torres lived just 15 minutes outside Millfield, and Mike had started a small security company staffed entirely by military veterans. When Danny called Mike, explaining that his father had been assaulted, Mike didn't hesitate. I moved to a table near the window where I could watch the parking lot. My cheek was still burning from the slap, and I could see Jenny looking at me with sympathy and embarrassment. Mel had retreated to the kitchen, probably debating whether to call the sheriff. The few remaining customers were finishing their meals as quickly as possible and heading for the exit. Crusher ordered the most expensive items on the menu and made increasingly crude comments about what would happen to anyone who didn't show proper respect to the Satan's sons. His companions joined in, making threats and telling stories about other small towns they'd visited. The atmosphere in the diner grew more tense with each passing minute. 18 minutes after I made my call, I saw the first black SUV pull into the parking lot. Then a second one. Then a third. 6 men emerged from the vehicles, all wearing dark tactical clothing and moving with the unmistakable precision of trained soldiers. I recognized Mike Torres immediately, even though he'd added some gray to his hair since his Army days. Mike and his team entered the diner like they were clearing a building in Fallujah. No unnecessary noise, no wasted movement, just professional competence that spoke of thousands of hours of training and real-world experience. The contrast between these men and the 3 bikers was immediately obvious to anyone with eyes to see. "Excuse me," Mike said, approaching Crusher's table with polite authority. "I understand there's been some kind of problem here." Crusher looked up, his expression shifting from confidence to uncertainty as he took in the 6 men facing him. These weren't local cops or weekend warriors. These were serious people who'd clearly seen serious action. "No problem here," Crusher said, but his voice had lost some of its earlier bravado. "Just having breakfast." "I see," Mike replied. "Well, I'm Mike Torres, and these are my associates. We're all military veterans, and we take a dim view of people who assault our fellow soldiers." "Soldier?" Crusher scoffed, gesturing toward me. "That old man's no soldier." Mike smiled, but it wasn't a friendly expression. "Sir, that old man is Command Sergeant Major Frank Garrison, retired. He served 34 years in the United States Army, including combat tours in Kuwait, Iraq, and Afghanistan. He's earned more decorations than you could name, and he's trained more soldiers than you've probably met in your lifetime. The color drained from Crusher's face. He glanced over at me, then back at Mike, clearly trying to process this information. Command Sergeant Major Garrison also happens to be the father of my former commanding officer, Captain Danny Garrison, who called to let us know that his dad had been assaulted by some tough guys who thought picking on a 72-year-old veteran would be fun. One of Mike's men, a tall black man with scars on his neck that suggested he'd seen heavy combat, stepped forward. Sergeant Major Garrison was my drill instructor at Fort Benning in 1998, he said quietly. He's the reason I made it through Ranger School. The reason a lot of us made it through. Another veteran, a stocky Hispanic man with sergeant stripes tattooed on his forearm, nodded. Sergeant Major Garrison trained my squad leader before my first deployment to Afghanistan. Everything that man taught him, he passed on to us. Probably saved my life more than once. The third veteran, a woman in her 40s with the bearing of a former officer, spoke up. Sir, with all due respect, you just assaulted one of the finest soldiers the Army ever produced. A man who spent his entire adult life serving his country and training young people to protect freedom. That's not going to stand. Crusher looked around the diner, realizing that he'd made a serious mistake. These weren't people he could intimidate or threaten. These were professionals who'd faced real enemies in real wars, and they were clearly prepared to defend one of their own. Look, he said, his voice much quieter now. Maybe I got a little carried away. Heat of the moment, you know? Mike shook his head. No, sir. This wasn't heat of the moment. This was a deliberate assault on a decorated veteran by someone who thought he could get away with it. The question is, what are you going to do to make it right? The conversation that followed was brief and to the point. Crusher was given two choices. He could apologize publicly to me and leave town immediately, or Mike could call the sheriff and press charges for assault. Given that assault on a person over 65 was a felony in our state, and given that the victim was a decorated war veteran, Crusher would likely face serious jail time. He chose the apology. Crusher approached my table with his head down, his earlier arrogance completely gone. In front of the entire diner, he apologized for his behavior and admitted that he'd been wrong to disrespect a veteran. He placed a $100 bill on the table to pay for my meal and any inconvenience he'd caused. But Mike wasn't finished. Sir, he said to Crusher, I want you to understand something. Command Sergeant Major Garrison isn't just some random old man you decided to pick on. He's family to every soldier he's ever trained, and that's a lot of soldiers. Word of this incident is going to spread through the veteran community, and if we hear that you or your club has bothered any other veterans anywhere, we're going to take it personally. The message was clear. Crusher nodded quickly, gathered his companions, and headed for the exit. Their motorcycles rumbled to life and disappeared down Main Street, leaving the diner quiet, except for the soft country music playing on the radio. Mike and his team stayed for coffee, sharing stories about their service and catching up on old times. Other customers began returning, and word of the incident spread quickly through town. Within an hour, the diner was fuller than it had been in months, with people stopping by to shake my hand and thank me for my service. Jenny refused to let me pay for my meal, and Mel emerged from the kitchen to personally thank me for my years of military service. Several other veterans in town, men I'd known casually for years, stopped by to introduce themselves properly and share their own stories of military service. That afternoon, Sheriff Patterson called to check on me and to let me know that the Satan's Sons had left the county. He also mentioned that he'd received calls from veterans organizations across the state, all offering support if the motorcycle club caused any more trouble. The following Thursday, I arrived at Mel's to find my usual booth reserved with a small sign that read, "Reserved for CSM Garrison." Jenny explained that Mel had decided to permanently reserve the table in recognition of my service. Other veterans in town had started stopping by on Thursday mornings, turning my quiet breakfast into an informal gathering of local military retirees. Danny called that evening from California, having heard about the incident from Mike. He was proud of how I'd handled the situation, and proud that his old unit had come to my aid. We talked for over an hour, sharing stories and memories that we'd never discussed before. 2 weeks later, I received a letter from the mayor declaring the first Thursday of each month Veterans Appreciation Day at Mel's Diner, with free breakfast for any military veteran. The local newspaper ran a story about the incident, focusing on the importance of respecting our veterans and the strong bonds formed through military service. The Satan's Sons never returned to Millfield. I heard later that they'd disbanded entirely after several encounters with veteran groups across the state. Apparently, word had spread through the military community about their behavior, and they'd found it increasingly difficult to operate in small towns where veterans looked out for each other. As for me, I kept coming to Mel's every Thursday morning, but now it was different. Instead of sitting alone with my newspaper, I was part of a community of veterans who'd found each other through shared service and mutual respect. We talked about our families, our health, our memories of military life, and our concerns about the world our grandchildren would inherit. The incident with Crusher had reminded me of something I'd forgotten during my quiet retirement. Once a soldier, always a soldier. The uniform might come off, but the bonds forged through service never break. When one of us is threatened, all of us respond. That's not just military tradition. It's family obligation. I still keep my medals in that shoebox in my bedroom closet, and I still don't like drawing attention to my military service. But I'm no longer just the quiet old man in the corner booth. I'm Command Sergeant Major Frank Garrison, retired, and I'm proud of every single day I wore the uniform in service to my country. Some battles you fight with weapons, some you fight with words, and some you fight by simply refusing to back down when bullies think they can push you around. At 72, I've learned that the most important battles are often the ones that remind us who we really are and what we truly stand for. The next time someone tries to tell me I'm just some helpless old man, they're going to discover what 34 years in the United States Army really means.